Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Dockendorf. I am a senior tax manager in the Minneapolis office here for Eide Bailey, and going to take about the next hour or so to walk through succession planning. It's a very hot topic right now. People are probably hearing a lot about it, but want to talk about the process that we look at, why we think starting your planning now is going to be really beneficial, and just some of the things that you want to consider along the way while we're working on your succession plan. All right, so what I'm planning to cover today is, first and foremost, going to kind of cover what are some of the current trends that we're seeing in the succession and exit planning space. Throughout the presentation, I'll kind of use succession planning, exit planning interchangeably, but they both mean the same thing. So that first thing we're going to look at is, are owners ready to exit their current business? The second item we're going to look at is, what exactly is succession exit planning and why is it important? Then we're going to cover the steps that we look at and consider when developing that exit strategy, that roadmap that we help our clients through. And then the fourth item there, we're going to cover some tax implications of the various exit strategies. You'll see when we get to that point later in the presentation, we hit on a high-level items right away. We're not going to get into a lot of great depth with that. It'd probably be more situational for each of those clients, but just want to make sure that everyone's aware of the potential opportunities that are out there for structuring your exit or succession strategy that you've got. So let's head into the current strategies here. So over the next couple slides, we're going to cover, I like these pie charts. I think they're very helpful. And these came from the Exit Planning Institute's State of Ownerness Ready Survey, and these are for the 2017 results for the Twin Cities metro area survey that they did. Just a little bit of background, the Exit Planning Institute is a national organization that obviously helps advisors that are in the exit planning space working with those business owners to help make that transition as smooth as possible. So not only do they have this Twin Cities metro area survey, but they have other surveys as well. I think they've had some for the Nashville area, the Phoenix area. So they kind of have them scattered across the U.S. So if you don't happen to be in the Twin Cities metro area and you're wondering if the report is out there for your area, if you go to the Exit Planning Institute's website, they should have a list there of all those owner readiness surveys to see maybe how the numbers and demographics might be a bit different in your area. But let's just kind of dive into here what we got for the Twin Cities metro area. So of the participants that were part of the survey, what are their current ages here? We can see that, over 80% of the participants were at least the age of 50 or older. We've got 45% that are age of 60 or older. So there's a lot of business owners that took part of the survey that are probably getting to the point where they're starting to think about that exit strategy that they've got, or, you see in that stat there, we've got 12% where the owners are more, age 70 plus. They may have, wish they had this strategy put in place earlier. They may be kind of at the point where they're not quite sure what that next phase is going to be with their business, with their own phase of their life after they exit their business. So you can see here that there's a lot of owners that might be in that window, and we'll get to that stat in a little bit about when they want to exit their business. That doing planning maybe a little bit ahead of time would have been probably really advantageous for them at that point. I like this stat. I like this slide a lot because it talks about annual company revenues. I feel like there's a common misconception that if you're looking at exit or succession planning, it's really only for the big, large companies. And I like this a lot because it really kind of puts in perspective a lot of the clients that we see at Eide Bailey, where a lot of the revenues for those companies are 25 million or less. Looking at this survey, over 80% of the respondents were in that 25 million or less annual revenue space, and over half of the participants had annual revenues of less than 5 million. There's a lot of value that can be done for those clients and helping them make sure that we're maximizing either the value of their business if they're going to try to take it to market or to sell it to somebody else, or we're maximizing all the hard work that they put in over the years, that they're going to be able to exit or transition their business successfully and have the retirement lifestyle that they want to have or that they've dreamed about while working that business for the last 20, 30, 40 plus years. So I like this stat a lot because it does kind of put it in perspective that, it isn't succession planning isn't just for the big companies. We can draw some insight from the large companies. There's a great book out there. It's called Built to Last, and it talks about some of the very large, well-known companies in the U.S. and sort of how they've been able to stay around for 100 years, 150 years. And in that book, it talks about their succession planning process. They're publicly traded companies now, but how do they go about picking that next CFO or the next CEO that's going to be there? They've got processes and procedures in place to make those transitions as smooth as possible. So we can kind of take some of those ideas and replicate that down into more of the clients that we work with, and helping them to create those same processes, procedures, strategies to make sure that they're going to be as successful as possible with that transition. The question here is having a transition strategy important? And you can see here from the responses that overwhelmingly they all agree or strongly agree that having that transition strategy is very important. But what's interesting, and isn't in this slide right here, but was kind of in the detail of the report, that even though we've got over 90% that either agree or strongly agree that having this transition strategy is important, 79% of the respondents had no written business transition plan. 94% had no written personal plan. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit later on, talking about how we have to do at the same time the business planning and the personal planning. And then 48% had done no planning at all. There wasn't really a lot of context behind that 48%. What does that really entail? Have they had any of these preliminary conversations? You could see here that they all agree or strongly agree that having this strategy is important, but a lot of the business owners haven't quite taken those steps to work on that strategy or work on that plan. Or they may have taken a couple of steps, but it's been sitting on the sidelines for the last 5 years or so. So we want to highlight the importance of keeping that process going, because you never know when a time might come up that you have to make a decision about transitioning that business. So when are they ready to exit, or when do the owners want to exit? This kind of ties back into the first slide where we talked about the demographics, the age demographics of some of the owners. You can see here that we've got over 50% plan to transition in the next 5 years. And then we look at almost 3/4 plan to transition in the next 10 years. So you can see where if in that 5-year window or in that 10-year window, we've got a lot of those business owners that are age 50 and older, or 60 and older. It doesn't leave us a lot of time to work on that transition strategy, or if we're working on that strategy, it might not leave all of the options on the table that they would have had they started this process sooner. So that's kind of the main key with the name of the presentation. Start planning now. That's one of the benefits, and I think another misconception that people have is they think if they start the process too soon, that there's going to be limited options that are going to be there, or the plan is going to be set it and they're going to kind of forget what's going to be there. And actually, the sooner we start, the more options that are available to us. You'll see as we get into our 7 steps, why that's important, where there may be time and ways we can help to increase value or find more ways to get other assets into the hands of the business owner that are outside of that business interest, getting more personal assets, filling up that personal bucket, where if we've got the time, it's going to put a lot more of those options on the table that we can really decide what's going to make the most sense. If we're in that 1 to 2 year window, or even in that 3-year window, there's still some things we can certainly help with. We just may not have all of the options in front of us to really put that transition strategy together. I would say, in my opinion and the experience that I've seen, sort of that 4 to 5 year window before the owner is ready to transition is sort of the minimum amount of time that we'd want to have, because it allows us to really sort of vet the situation, figure out what's going on, because it's a fairly long process to kind of work these strategies all the way through. And the owners are also busy running a business. We want to make sure that there's enough time in front of us that we can really make sure that we're addressing all the goals and objectives that those owners have. This one I think is important as well, and we'll talk about it in a little bit here with the steps that we take as well. But do the owners who are exiting need their business to remain profitable to make that transition as successful as possible. You can see here that there's a good number that need that business to remain successful, to have that transition be as successful as it possibly can. And what I kind of gleaned from this slide is a lot of those owners, if they're making that transition, to get them the value that they need at the end of the day, they may need current cash flow after they've transitioned that business ownership to pay off the note or to get the value back out to them for the interest that they transferred. If they sold it to their kids or sold it to a key employee, and let's say it's on a 10-year note, well, the children of that key employee may be using cash flow from the business to pay off that 10-year note. So obviously, if business suffers and cash flow isn't nearly as strong, it's going to be a lot harder for the owner that transitioned out to get their full value at the end of the day. So we want to kind of keep that in mind while we're working through this process, is how much are we relying on cash flow from the business after we've transitioned ownership, who are we transitioning it down to, and include those factors as part of our analysis. And one of the things, my favorite stat, which isn't up here right now, but 100% of business owners one day will not be a business owner, whether that's voluntarily or involuntarily. So what we're trying to achieve with this succession planning process is making sure whenever that day comes, whether you're deciding to sell it to an outside third party, maybe it's a private equity group, or you're planning to transition it down to your children, or an offer comes along that you never thought would be there, we're going through this process and we know what we want to accomplish. So when those opportunities come up, we're able to make an informed decision, well, whether or not that's a good decision for us. And same thing if something were to happen that you have to suddenly transition out of the business, is the business going to be able to be taken care of? What about your family? What about some of the key employees that you've got that are inside of that business as well? So it's my favorite stat that, all business owners, unfortunately, one day will not be an owner. And hopefully we're able to be a part of it where we can make that decision voluntarily and be able to step out of the business when the owner wants to, on their time frame, and hopefully transition into the individuals that they desire. So what is exit or succession planning? How we look at it, it's holistically looking at all the factors that impact the business owner and guiding that owner through the process of exiting their business on their terms and conditions. And it's just good overall business strategy, in our opinion. And you'll kind of see as we start talking about the steps that are there, it is holistically looking at everything. We're not looking at just the business, which is obviously very important. We're looking at some of the other factors that go into that business, key employees, customer bases. We want to make sure that we're looking at the business owner's personal financial situation. We want to make sure that they're going to be able to have the retirement, be able to achieve the goals that they want to after they've transitioned out of their business. Which again, we're going to cover all those items in the next handful of slides with the steps that we like to take. And I'll say it again, I'll probably say it a couple times throughout the presentation, but these plans are living and breathing. We're going to put something in place right now that could change in 3 to 5 years, or 6, 7, 8 years down the road. But if we're taking the time up front to create that plan, create that framework, it's a lot easier to make those adjustments on the fly as decisions come up, making sure that we're able to assess, is this the right move? If an offer comes on the table, like I said, is that the right number that we're looking for? Is it maybe more than we ever thought we'd get for the business, that it's a no-brainer to pull the trigger on that? So these are living, breathing things, and you'll see where, I mentioned their good business strategy. We'll talk about some business continuity planning in the next handful of slides as well. And just to kind of talk about how this is, or to give you an example of how this is, in a living, breathing process, is I'm working with a client right now, C corporation, husband and wife own 100%. They each own 50% of the business, and they've got 2 sons. They have 3 kids total, 2 sons that work in the business. Their oldest daughter isn't involved in the business, but they've got about a 10-year timeline until they're looking to transition out. So we're going through our process, we're going through the steps, helping to create that framework, providing some insights, some ideas about how we can help make this as successful as possible. But we know we're going to come back 3 years down the road and reassess, okay, where are we at? Did the people that we had identified to take over the business, are they still progressing at the pace that we were hoping that they were? Or are there certain things that they need help with to continue their progression into having more of those leadership or ownership decisions? 5, 6 years down the road, we're continuing to reassess where we're at to see if there's any adjustments we need to make along the way, that when time does come that husband and wife want to leave the business, they can leave so confidently, they can leave so knowing that they've done everything they can to kind of help set up that next generation of owners to be as successful as possible. So you can see where it is just, holistic looking at everything, allowing us to have plenty of time to put this process in place and to be able to make adjustments on the fly if we need to, depending upon what happens throughout the process. So we do have our first polling question here. Holistically looking at all the factors that impact the business owner and guiding that owner through the process of exiting his or her business on their terms and conditions, true or false?
100%
All right.
true.
Perfect. So next we're going to look at, the components that we think of when looking at an exit or succession plan. These are kind of the 7 components that we have here that we look at when building out those plans for the owners that we're working with. And, over the next handful of slides, we'll kind of go a bit more in depth with each of these. But I wanted to kind of take a moment right now to talk about, sort of how this really, plays out, in real life scenarios, or why we think this is advantageous, and really my passion behind being more involved in this space and helping owners create that strategy and making sure that transition as successful as it possibly can be. So my mother-in-law, whose name is Patty, she was a 2nd generation business owner. Her dad initially started out in kind of the marine auto sales space, and the marine sales space, and it turned into more auto dealerships. She is one of 6 children, and she was about the only child that consistently worked in the business when her dad was running it. And she was kind of by his side the entire time as they were building it. They ended up having multiple locations throughout central Minnesota. And in the early 90s, he suddenly passed away. And the business interest, which my mother-in-law didn't have any ownership at that time, her dad owned 100%. His interest went to his wife, so Patty's mom. And she had that ownership interest there. And things kind of continued on for the next couple of years. And in about the mid 90s, Patty's mom fired her from the business. And the story that we've heard, talking to some of her other siblings, is that there were a couple brothers that were sort of in mom's ear that wanted more cash flow from the business. They wanted more in distributions because they saw how well the dealership was doing, that they wanted some of that cash right now. And, Patty was, thinking more long term. She's putting money back into the business, helping to grow it, find new facilities, or build new buildings, expand locations, those sorts of things that, the brothers wanted the cash flow now. So they got into mom's ear and were able to kind of get her out of the picture by having mom fire her. Well, fast forward another 3-4 years later, Patty ends up coming back to her mom and buys her out 100%. She comes in, buys out the 100% interest. She wants she wants that business interest, and always had wanted that interest. So she comes out and buys mom's interest from her. She continues on, again, in central Minnesota. She was Entrepreneur of the Year in that area multiple times over, was very heavily involved in the community. And then around the early 2000s, about 2004, she gets a divorce. And as part of that discussion with her ex-spouse, as far as divvying up assets and everything, she wanted to keep that 100% business interest. So to allow her to retain that interest, she gave up her roughly $1 million 401k that she had accumulated over the years. So ex-spouse gets the large 401k, Patty keeps the business interest, and everything kind of, they part ways and everything continues on. Well, again, fast forward another couple years, about 2009-ish, she is diagnosed with semantic dementia, which is kind of a rare form of dementia that's out there. And along the way, she had some key employees that were very crucial to the dealership continuing to progress in the manner that it did. And they were starting to become frustrated with some of the decisions that she was making. They weren't quite sure what she was thinking, where she wanted to go, what that direction was going to be. And because nobody knew at that time that she had this type of dementia. So having those key employees grow and be frustrated they ended up leaving the business, and they caused a lot of headaches along the way. She lost some very key people that had been with her for probably close to 20 years, that had been involved with the business. So after having those issues, we were really starting to get her, she was diagnosed, and we realized that, the best thing to happen for her as the disease continued to progress was to sell the business. So we took a business, or my wife's family took the business that was probably at one point in time worth 3.5 to 4 million. And due to the situations and the circumstances that they were in, they ended up selling it for about 750,000. So we had an extremely very successful business that was there. And, due to the situation, due to sort of her involuntarily having to leave the business, we're able to only sell it for a fraction of what it was worth at that point in time, or what it could have been. Now, I share the story not to really scare people, but I'm sure we all know someone that's had a similar issue, or someone that had to leave their business sooner than they wanted to, that, going through this process, making sure that we have some of this good strategy in place and a plan in place, is we can kind of tackle each of the things that happened in my mother-in-law's story along the way in stride, that it isn't going to hopefully cripple the business or put the family in a position that they didn't expect to be in had they continued to have that business ownership, or had some of those unforeseen circumstances didn't happen. So that's why it's kind of my passion behind helping owners through this process. Is I want to make sure, since we know all owners will leave one day, that we have them ready to leave whenever they want to, or if a situation like my mother-in-law's happens, that the business is still going to be taken care of, that their family is still going to be taken care of. So I know it's kind of a long story there, but I just kind of wanted to highlight that, to see how it's going to play out in each of these steps that we've got. So the first step that we like to look at, and even with these 7, we have them listed here in order. They don't necessarily have to go in order. There may be certain things that we need to address or tackle first. That's, of importance right now, that we can address other items later. But I think the first 2 items there, the identifying the owner's exit objectives and goals, and then quantifying the business and personal financial resources, if there aren't any other pressing issues, I think those are the first 2 that we need to address. And kind of here's why. With that step 1, trying to identify the owner's exit goals and objectives, 3 main questions that are there that we want to try to address right away is, how much longer do they want to work in the business before they retire? Who do they want to transfer that business to? And what do they need in annual after-tax income during retirement in today's dollars to have that retirement that they want to have? If we're asking the question, when do they want to retire? If it's 5 years from now, great. We've got some time to make some decisions. If they said that they wanted to retire 2 years ago, but they couldn't, our hands might be a bit more tied as far as options that we got available to us. That's that second question there. Who do they want to transfer it down to? Is it the children? Is there another owner in the business that they want to buy your interest? Is it key employees? Are we going to take it to market, that we might get a potential private equity offer, or selling it to a competitor with an outside third party? Depending upon which route we want to go is going to determine what do we sort of want for value at the end of the day, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And then obviously, we want to make sure that the owners, when they exit, that they're going to have the annual after-tax income that they want or need during retirement. That they can do the things they're getting the value for all the hard work that they put in over the years to, they're going to see that benefit at the end of the day. And not only do we have these 3 kind of quantitative questions, oftentimes there's a lot of value-based items that the owners are concerned about, or there's value-based objectives or goals that they want to accomplish as well. Ways that we help kind of uncover those value-based goals is we ask, 3 more questions that are there is, what is that owner's vision for the company without them? What is their vision for themselves without the company? Oftentimes if these owners have had these businesses for 20, 30, 40 years, or you're talking multiple generations of ownership, those businesses can sort of define the family a little bit. So when an owner looks to transition out, sort of what does their role look like if they're not directly associated with being part of that business? And those are sometimes key questions that some of those owners struggle with, to make sure that they know what they're going to do after they've transitioned out. Kind of the third question that's there is there a particular value-based goal that's important to them with either of the visions? I've got a few objectives here that I've seen and talked to clients about. Obviously, this is sort of an endless list that's there, but one of the value-based items might be family harmony. If they have some children in the business, some that aren't in the business, or they're trying to treat everybody equally, maybe the best thing for them is to sell that business to an outside third party, get cash for it, and then at the end of the day, when they're distributing out, as part of their estate plan, the assets, each of the kids will be essentially getting cash, which is a lot easier to make that equal versus somebody getting a business interest and somebody getting other assets that might be there. Maybe there's a legacy that they want to maintain. Culture. I think culture is a big piece that a lot of owners are very proud of the culture that they've built. And a lot of the clients that I've worked with, there's a very strong culture amongst the employees. There's a lot of pride that they have in working for those businesses. They want to see it be very successful. They want to help out in any way that they can. That if you're going to sell it to an outside third party, or maybe be acquired by a bigger company, there's that concern that that culture may change. And how is that going to impact the employees at the end of the day? From a community standpoint, what if you're the large employer in that community or in that area, that they want to make sure that that business is going to stay there to continue to help and benefit the members of that community? That could be a big piece for some of these owners, that they want to make sure that that's going to be taken care of. And I think the last one there, it's on a lot of people's minds. They want to try to minimize taxes as much as possible. So what are some of the strategies that might be there to help minimize that tax impact as much as we possibly can? So the second step that we have is we want to try to understand, I call this the gap or the bridge analysis that we do. We want to try to understand and quantify what the business value is versus what their personal financial resources are. And when I talk about the bridge or the gap is, if we know on the personal side that in that annual after-tax dollars, in today's dollars, that the owner needs $5 million to walk away today, knowing that they're going to have enough money set aside for retirement that they can achieve all the goals that they want to. So if we've got $5 million in one side, but then we look at the value of the business, which might be 80 to 90% of their net worth, but that business is only worth 3.5, we've got $1.5 million gap there. And we even think we're going to need to have more in business value than that 5 million, because we have to factor in taxes along the way. So we need to initially kind of sit down, do that assessment, kind of see where we're at. And if we do have that gap where we need more personal financial resources when they walk away from that ownership than what the business is currently worth, we need to start figuring out ways to how do we help increase the value of that business. And we'll talk about some of those value enhancement drivers in a couple slides. But hopefully through that process of increasing the value of the business, we're not having to sacrifice what those owners want to do in retirement because they don't quite have the financial resources that they need or want to have to accomplish all of those goals. So oftentimes when we're doing this analysis, everyone kind of has the water cooler value for their business, or has a rough idea of what they think they need at the end of the day. On the personal side, to say, yep, I'm going to spend, $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year, whatever that dollar amount is. But in this analysis, we need to have some accurate information, and that's where a business valuation may come in handy to really assess to see where you're at. Is there, are we really worth 3.5? If that is the case, what are some of the other businesses going for in their industry? What are some of the things that they might be doing that we could find ways to increase the value of our business? Or maybe there's a niche that your business has that you've got a lot of value that's going to be there, that'd be very attractive to outside parties if that's the route that you wanted to go. So, while we're on that subject, talking about why the importance of having a business valuation is, first and foremost, sophisticated buyers are going to require one. Would you sell your assets without first knowing what they're worth, or would you sell your business without knowing what it's worth? And going through and having that business valuation done and knowing where it currently sits and currently stands allows us to continue to analyze that gap analysis, figure out what can we do to increase the value of that business. But it also arms us with what it happens if we get that offer that maybe it's somebody calls up, or that we get some sort of inquiry in the mail, whatever the situation might be, but somebody knows that the business is out there and they're giving us 1.5 times what it's currently worth, 2 times what it's currently worth. So having that valuation, having that knowledge of what your business is currently worth allows you to make those decisions going forward. Like I said before, you may have that offer on the table that it's going to be hard to turn down or that you can't refuse. that valuation is going to help us understand where that is to determine whether or not it's even an option that an offer that we want to entertain from that perspective. The second item there, is the business worth enough to support your needs? If we find that like we talked in that initial analysis, that we need 5 million at the end of the day, but the business is only worth 3.5, what are some of the other ways and strategies that we have that we can start to get more value out of the business before you need to retire, to start filling up that personal bucket? Maybe there's a retirement plan that we can put in place. There's some strategies and retirement plans that are out there that could allow the owner to put away pretty sizable dollar amounts, that if we know we can't get that full 5 million at the end of the day, but there's ways that we can start taking little chunks and putting it more in that personal bucket and needing less from the business. We want to start doing those strategies as soon as possible to make sure that we can transfer as much value as we possibly can. And, in business value, that third point there, business value is relative, not fixed. There's going to be a lot of things that could happen that could have an impact on that business valuation. Like I mentioned, we'll talk some of those value enhancement drivers here in the next couple of slides. But we know if we need to increase that value, what are some of the things that we can do to go ahead and increase that value in the eyes of a potential buyer or your co-owner that might be looking to buy that interest. So we know that if we value it today, 6 months from now, it could be dramatically different. So it kind of just gives us that snapshot in time, arms us with the information that we need, and allows us to make those decisions moving forward. I think we've got, polling question number 2 here.
Alrighty. Polling question number 2. Step 1 of the exit planning is deciding your objectives and goals. This is true or false. Derek, while they're filling this out, we do have a question, and I think it's relatable now, just in case she doesn't want to stay on.
Sure.
Will any of the information presented here be applicable to nonprofits?
I haven't worked much in the nonprofit space, but I think whether there's, because typically with a nonprofit you don't have ownership, but I think with a lot of people that are in those, those C-suite spaces, when they're looking to do that retirement, or they're looking to retire and transition out of that role, I think there are a lot of steps in this process that could be applicable in their situation. Looking at that personal financial planning. We'll get into a couple things later on with making sure that the estate plan and things like that sync up and everything's talking to each other. So I definitely think that there's a lot of overlap that's there. Some of the business strategy ideas as far as value and things like that may not necessarily be applicable in their situation, but I think there definitely is some overlap that would be there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
That polling question is now closed, and here are the results. 93% true. And go right ahead.
All right. So just a couple more items here on the importance of business valuation. If we know that the value is less than what we currently need at the end of the day, it could be a way to help motivate management or key employees to help increase the value. Maybe there's ways that we're tying bonuses or incentives to the overall growth of the business. We're creating some growth goals that are going to be there, and if we hit some of those targets, management or the key employees know that if they hit their targets, that there's going to be something for them at the end of the day. So there's value to the owner to increase the business, but there's also an incentive that's there for those management key employees to help increase the value of that business. And then, there's on that far right column there's valuation discounts. Depending upon how the ownership is structured, if we have voting and non-voting interests, there could be discounts like lack of marketability, lack of control. Because if I'm a 20% owner in a business, and I would try to take that 20% to market, and if my 20% is worth $1 million, somebody's likely not going to pay me $1 million because I have no control. There's not really a readily available market to sell those interests. So if I think it's worth $1 million in somebody else's eyes, I'll be like, well, I'll give you 800,000 for it. So there's some of those discounts that do come into play. Not as important now after tax reform. We'll kind of touch on that in a little bit. But there still could be good reasons why we'd want to get that valuation done to maximize some of those valuation discounts. There are some estate and gift planning techniques where having those discounts in play can be very important at the end of the day. So just a couple more items there as far as why having that business valuation is important. Some of the value drivers that we discussed, these are some of the things that if we have these processes, procedures in place that could really help to increase the overall value of our business. The bottom one that's down there, if we've got an established and diversified customer base, if we're looking to go to market and 60% of our revenue comes from 2 customers, that may be a red flag for some potential buyers that might be out there. Or even if you're looking to transfer it down to children or to key employees, if the owner who's exiting has those relationships and those customers know that once that owner's out the door, that they're going to be dealing with somebody new, if those relationships aren't transferred appropriately, those customers may go someplace else. And having those 1 or 2 or 3 customers or whatever that large percentage is go somewhere else, that can be very detrimental to that transition being as successful as it possibly can be, especially if that owner who's exiting needs the cash flow from that business. A couple other items that are here that, just some other value drivers that we've seen. Obviously, cash is king at the bottom there. So if you've got strong, stable cash flow, that's what buyers are going to be looking for. They're looking for that return on investment and trying to get to that point as quickly as possible. And having some realistic growth strategies. If you've got ideas about how you want to grow the business and it's it's planned out, it's properly communicated, everyone's on the same page as far as how we're going to try to get to that point, that could be attractive to a lot of buyers. If you've got that management team that's helping to build those growth strategies, and knowing that management team likely is going to be there, some of those buyers, that may be very attractive to them, because if that group's going to stay in place, they know the business, they know how they're going to help drive it and continue that growth going forward, that buyers may be willing to pay a premium for something like that. So now we kind of get into the 4th and 5th step here, as far as talking about different exit routes, that we call it, that owners can go through. And really there's sort of 2 paths you can go down. You can do a ownership transfer to an outside third party, which is the step that we're going to talk about now, or we can do an internal transfer, which is step 5 here, which we'll get into in just a second. And depending upon which path the owner wants to go down, really sort of dictates what we're looking for from a value standpoint at the end of the day. If we're looking to take it to market, whether it's to a private equity company or to a competitor, or maybe there's an acquisition that's going to be there, we want to try to maximize that sales price as much as we possibly can. We want to maximize that business value, and we want to accelerate the payment of those proceeds and try to get as much upfront as we possibly can. Obviously, there may be a situation where there's earnouts, there's stay bonuses possibly that may be in play, where we might be able to get 80% of the value up front, but that other 20% may come over a 2 or 3 year time frame to really complete that 100% transfer, or 100% of that value going into the hands of the owner who's exiting. And if you are looking to take something to market, we have very strong relationships with private equity firms, investment bankers, brokers that could possibly help with that sale. But if you're also thinking that this is the route that you want to go, knowing what those potential buyers are looking for ahead of time will, and having those conversations with our group that helps the owners down that path can also be very advantageous, because they're going to help walk through the financials with you of your business, help you look at, all right, where are you currently at? What are the buyers looking for? And how do we help get you to the point that you need to be at the end of the day, and maximize that value that's going to be there? A couple other options that we see with the external transfers. Maybe you're going to take it public with an IPO. Maybe you're going to recapitalize some of the interest and sell some to an outside third party, but retain some. The one in the top left there, orderly liquidation, it is an option. Obviously, it's not the best option that's going to be there, because that essentially means we're sort of just winding down the operations of the business and probably selling the equipment or the receivables or whatever inventory might be there to potential buyers. So if we're going down that route, which hopefully we don't have to, but we're likely going to get less in value at the end of the day with that orderly liquidation. And then step 5 there is, the second route, the second path that owners can take, and that's a transfer of ownership to what we call an inside party. So it's co-owners, it's key employees. Maybe we're going to do an ESOP, which is an employee stock ownership plan, or maybe I want to get it down to my children. and then I'm either going to sell it to them, I'm going to gift it to them, or maybe I do a combination of both. And usually when we do this transfer of ownership to inside parties, we want sort of the opposite compared to transfer to an outside third party, where the outside third party we wanted to maximize value. With this inside transfer, we may want to try to minimize that value as much as possible. And why would we want to do that? Well, oftentimes if there's a co-owner or key employees, and oftentimes the children don't have a lot of cash up front that you're going to get upon the transfer of that interest. You're going to be probably taking back a note that may be a 10-year note or a 15-year note that you're going to get paid out over time. And oftentimes that note, like I mentioned previously, is tied back to the cash flow of the current business. So if we know that they're not going to be able to buy as much, that's where understanding that that's the route we want to go, we can find other ways to fill up more of that personal bucket that we don't need as much from that business when we do decide to transfer that interest down to those inside parties at the end of the day. Business continuity planning, obviously is a very important part of the overall succession plan, especially if you have other co-owners. Buy-sell agreement is a key piece that's going to be there. And if you do have a buy-sell, when was the last time that it was looked at and updated? If it's being funded with life insurance, when you initially took those policies out, the value of the business may have been, dramatically lower than what it currently is today. So is there enough behind that buy-sell agreement that if something were to happen to one of the owners, that they're going to be able to get the value down to the family of the owner who may have predeceased or is transferring their ownership at the end of the day. In my mother-in-law's situation, loss of key talent, whether it's the business owner or other key employees, that can have a pretty detrimental impact to the overall performance of the business. So, these are the proverbial getting the hit by the bus scenarios that, the involuntary transfers or transitions of ownership, where we want to make sure that we've got these pieces that are going to be there kind of as a safety net for not only the business, but for your family as well, to make sure that they're going to be taken care of at the end of the day, as well as the business. And then kind of the last step here is having our personal wealth and estate plan. There's things that we can do, doing that financial planning, which is part of that gap analysis, making sure that our estate planning documents, we want to make sure that everything syncs up and is talking to one another. We don't want our estate plan to say that the business should be split amongst the kids 50-50, but then we realize in our succession plan that, well, only one of the kids should really be in charge. We want to make sure that if that's going to be the case, that the two documents are saying the same thing. Maybe they'll both have ownership, but one has more leadership and control than the other one does. And through this process, we can really analyze the situation and figure out, how do we transfer wealth to the next generation? How do we do this as efficiently as possible from an income tax perspective, minimizing those taxes, but still achieving and accomplishing the owner's goals and objectives at the end of the day? So kind of on that note, just a real high level on the current estate tax environment as a result of tax reform. So when reform passed in December of 2017, it essentially doubled the federal estate exemption from what would have been $5.6 million to, it was $11.18 million in 2018. Now that was indexed up to $11.4 million per person in 2019. So you've got roughly $22 million per married couple that you can transfer either during your lifetime or at death and not have to worry about any federal estate tax. You may live in a state that has its own state estate tax. Minnesota is one of those, and Minnesota has a much lower exemption. We currently have a $2.7 million exemption for 2019, which is set to increase to $3 million by 2020. So you can see there's a big gap there between what the federal exemption is compared to what the Minnesota state exemption is. And you may be in a state that has a smaller exemption as well. So we want to make sure that we're planning for each of those scenarios and factoring that in along the way. These increased exemptions are set to sunset or roll back to what it would have been in 2018 prior to tax reform. And that rollback date is, as of right now, January 1st of 2026. And the exemption would have been $5.6 million for 2018 prior to tax reform. So they think with inflation, that number might be in the $6 to $7 million range come 2026. But we'll see what happens with the elections, because that likely might change between now in 2026. We'll have to kind of stay tuned there. One of the good things that didn't change with tax reform is portability. Portability is still in play, and basically what that means is the roughly $11 million that each spouse would have, whatever isn't used during their lifetime or at death, the unused exemption you can give to the surviving spouse. So if my wife and I both have 11 million, when I die, if I've used 5 of mine, so I've got 6 million that I haven't used, I could file an estate tax return, a federal estate tax return, elect portability, and I can give my unused 6 million to my wife. So now her exemption went from 11 million to 17. So really what it does is it allows you to not miss out on some of that exemption that's going to be there due to one of the spouses passing away sooner rather than later. So next item we're going to talk about here is just kind of some emotional considerations. I know going through this process, succession planning is never just about succession. Oftentimes there's a lot of underlying feelings that are there. Go back to my mother-in-law situation. There were some siblings that wanted the cash flow. They didn't like how the other one was running the business or whatever it might be. If you've got children that are in the business, some that aren't, or there's a lot of factors that are there that it's never just about transitioning that ownership. Oftentimes there's a lot of other emotional considerations that need to be taken into consideration as a part of it. So what we try to do is gauge the emotions of the people involved. So it's not just the owner. We want to talk to, if wife owns 100% of the business, we want to include that. We want to make sure that we're including the emotions of the spouse, of the children, of some of the key employees that might be there, to make sure that we're factoring that in as part of our analysis to, again, help position them that when that transition happens, that it's going to be as successful as possible. If mom or dad are going to transition the business down to the children, but the key employees that are there don't have any faith in those children stepping into that role, or if they don't feel like they've earned that role, when that ownership transition happens, you may find that it doesn't sit well with a lot of those key employees because they think that next generation maybe hasn't earned it yet, or whatever the situation might be, that they may end up leaving the business. That would put you in a tough position kind of going forward. So there's a lot of emotions that need to be considered. Not necessarily the most fun thing for a lot of people to kind of dive into, but it is very important at the end of the day to make sure that we're kind of putting all this on the table, assessing it, trying to determine what the impact's going to be, and how we need to factor that into our plan as we continue to move forward. A couple of things that we find that what helps to make these successions as successful as possible. The first item that's there, we just touched on, acknowledge and deal with the changes, emotions involved. And it's not just the next generation that's stepping in or the key employees. What are the emotions of the owner who is transitioning their interests? Like I mentioned, they may have been in this business for 20, 30, 40 years. It's going to be a big change for them when they're no longer walking in that door on a daily basis. We also need to make sure that we continue to put the interest of the business first. That's the underlying asset that's going to be there. And while this process does take some time, and like I mentioned, it is a living, breathing process, we don't want to lose sight of where that business needs to go, or as continue operations as they're going forward. And kind of in line with that third bullet point there, you need to believe in and commit to this process. The client that I've got, even that I mentioned previously, even though they've got 10 years till they're going to retire, they're committed to this process. They know that it's going to take a while, and it may be frustrating at times that you're not seeing large leaps from one thing to the next, or as we're setting kind of benchmarks that we're trying to get to. It may not feel like you're getting anywhere, but really at the end of the day, we are making progress. We are making strides going forward that hopefully when the time comes that you do transfer that interest, you're like, yep, that was exactly what we wanted to see. Everything played out how we were hoping to, and overall was a smooth process. And then we want to make sure that we allow sufficient time for that succession. Like we talked about with the earlier slides from that Exit Planning Institute survey, where we talked about the timeline for when some of those owners want to retire. If we only have a couple year window, if we only have a 1 to 3 year window, there might not be a lot of options on the table that we could do to help increase value or to try to get more into the hands of the owner if that's the position that we're currently in. If we've got that 5 years, 10 years would be great. If we've got that time frame to start working on these plans, that's we can really help put a lot of pieces in place at the end of the day that are going to make this as successful as possible. again, kind of touched on here some more of the emotional reasons why owners avoid planning. It just could make for unpleasant conversations, whether it's internally with family, how we're going to transition assets, whatever that might be. Maybe it's unpleasant conversations with management. If they don't think that the next generation is fit to take over that role, or maybe they wanted to have an opportunity to take over a larger role in the business. If we're not having those conversations, there could be a lot of feelings that are hurt, or a lot of issues that could make the transition harder than it needs to be to make it as successful as possible. I like this because it kind of highlights the importance of having that time frame, having time on our side. This is from the Family Business Institute, and you can kind of see here, the left side shows how long they've been planning, how many years they've been doing succession planning, and on the right side it shows what's the probability, or what was the likelihood that they were still in business 15 years later. So if they were 10 plus years, there's a really good chance that they're going to be around 15 years later. If we're doing it in less than 2 years, we've got a 25% chance that that business is going to be able to continue on and still be around 15 years later. So again, it just goes back and highlights the importance of why we would want to start this process sooner rather than later. So here we've got some issues, tensions that might be there. Again, this is from a PricewaterhouseCoopers family survey. You guys can kind of take a look at that, but since we're getting a little short on time, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through each of these. But you can see that a lot of family items do pop up that may cause a lot of conflict, tension, or disagreements in working through these succession plans. That the sooner that we can address them, the smoother we can make that transition. So we've got our third polling question here.
All right, our third polling question: succession in a closely held business is never just about succession. 98% true. Go ahead there.
All right, thank you, Amy. There we go. Okay, so the last bit here that we're going to kind of talk about, and again, I mentioned this right away, that we're just going to real high level touch on the tax consequences, because we'd want to analyze in each situation what's going to be the impact and what's going to make the most sense at the end of the day. So we know that buyers and sellers are going to want different things from these transitions, from these sales. Buyers are going to want cash flow. They're going to want to find ways to get that cash flow back as soon as possible. Maybe it's to service the debt that they've taken on to acquire that business. Maybe it's a return on investment. They also want to try to minimize the taxes on the business operation as much as possible. So typically, they like to purchase the assets because they could go ahead, increase the value of those assets, repurchase or redepreciate some of those, accelerate some more deductions that are going to be there. And when they're buying the assets, they're not really buying the potential skeletons that may be in the closet compared to if they're buying stock. Where the seller is the exact opposite. Again, they want to try to minimize taxes, but they're looking to sell stock rather than assets, because a stock sale usually gets most likely the more preferential capital gain treatments, versus if they're selling asset, there may be some ordinary income that has to be taken into consideration. So that's where those sellers typically like to sell stock, because it gets that capital gain treatment, and any of the liabilities associated with that company remain with the stock. So they're not taking on any additional risk after they've transitioned that ownership to whoever that buyer is going to be. And depending upon if you can't find some middle ground, things you could look at, if the seller if they wanted to sell the assets, they could demand a higher price, knowing that they're going to pay more in income taxes. But if they're also really keen and set on selling that stock, maybe we have to accept a lower price as part of that transaction. So that's where figuring out, going back to the routes that we're going to go down to transition that ownership, is really going to help kind of dictate the price that we may get at the end of the day, and help us kind of guide us down that path. If we're going to sell assets versus stock, if it's going to an outside third party, there's some considerations that we want to think about along the way there as well. Here's just kind of high level ways. Again, this could be a presentation in and of itself with the various options to structure the sale. Again, stock purchase, asset purchase. This, like I said, could be an hour-long presentation itself. Just kind of wanted to more put that out there so people knew what the potential options might be if you're working with your CPA through that transition. And then the options for the transfer to family, kind of three high-level items there that we're looking at, death, outright sale, or a lifetime gift. Each has its advantages and disadvantages, which we'll kind of cover here real quickly. If it's transfer at death, one of the advantages, based on the estate tax provisions that are there, you're going to get a step up in basis. So in the hands, when that business is transferred to the next generation at the time of death, the kids will get step up in basis to fair market value. Generally, there's no income tax cost at that point in time. And their parents also retain the cash flow for their lifetime. One of the big disadvantages that is there is the heirs need to wait for ownership. They may not want to wait around to transition that ownership until mom or dad pass away. And any future appreciation we have in that business, since mom and dad have that ownership interest, would be includable in their estate at death. That, depending upon the value, could be subject to federal estate tax, Minnesota estate tax, and the varying tax rates that might be there. If it's an outright sale, again, advantage, heirs get the ownership immediately. One of the disadvantages for the parent, if it's bought on a note, the cash flow from the business for those parents stop as soon as that note's paid off. So they maybe only have 10 more years of getting that cash flow stream from that business. That once that 10 years is up, we need to make sure that they've got enough in that personal bucket, because they're not going to continue to get payments from that note, from that installment sale going forward. So some pluses and minuses there, because the heirs may not have all the cash up front. That's why the parents have to take the note. But it's a way to get the parents the value, but it's going to come over time. And then when that note's paid off, that's going to be the last part there. Now, with an outright sale, we can do those installment notes. There's an applicable federal rate that we could charge for like an internal family note that's there. And we could structure those notes to be amortization. They could be interest only with a balloon payment at the end, or they could be amortized over the life of the loan with a larger balloon payment that might be there at the end of that note term. And then if it's a lifetime gift, one of the advantages is the heirs get that ownership right away. But one of the main disadvantages that's going to be there is carryover basis. So you're not going to get that step up. If it's $100 in the hands of mom and dad, it's going to be $100 in the hands of the heirs that they make that gift to. And there could be the underlying appreciation sort of stays there intact. That could be taxed in the future and maybe quite substantial at that point in time. So there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those. And we'll kind of get to the last polling question here. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour.
All right. The last polling question here, another true or false. Interest rate is AFR based on term of note. And you can see what note can be down below. 94% true. Go ahead there, Derek.
All right. Okay, so one final item. I know we're just at our time here. So I just kind of want to reiterate and highlight again that, this planning process is an ongoing living, breathing thing where, we're trying to create that framework right now that maybe need to be adapted in the future, but allows us the flexibility and it puts all the options that are going to possibly be there for us on the table that we can then decide what's going to make the most sense. Timing there, hopefully you've gathered through this webinar that, we can never start the process too soon. Every owner that started a business had an idea of getting into the business, but at the same time, when you started, we should be thinking about how am I going to get out at the end of the day? So we can never start this process too soon, but if we do wait too long, that could be detrimental to making that transition as successful as it possibly could be. So we don't want to wait too long before we start, but we, again, want to highlight that we can never start this process too soon because we know we can adapt and change with it along the way. And even with those 7 steps that we covered, no 2 paths are going to be the same because each owner is going to have different goals and objectives. Their businesses are going to be different. The industries that they're in are going to be different. So going through this process, if you even have a fellow owner that has a similar business to you, your plans are likely going to look different because you likely both have different goals and objectives that you want to achieve. So going through this process, it's not cookie cutter. We're trying to design this to match what the owner wants to achieve at the end of the day. So that kind of the last point there, we can capture all of your hard work that the owner and the family members have put into that business, throughout the years. Maybe it's the legacy we want to continue to have on that it's going to transfer on to the next generation, or we want to try to maximize the value that's going to be there. We want to make sure that through this process, we're capturing all the hard work, all the blood, sweat, tears that went into running those businesses and kind of creating those things from scratch. So if we can kind of keep that in mind as we go, hopefully at the end of the day, we'd be able to help get that plan to being a point that we can make that transition as successful as it possibly can be. So with that, I know we're just slightly over our time, but any questions that are there, we can reach out to Amy. Otherwise, if you do have to go, my contact information is at the beginning of the slides. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. If you do have a question or just kind of want to walk through some things, would love to have the conversation and help get things started.
Awesome. There's no questions right this moment, but on the slide here, you can see some of our upcoming webinars in May if you would like to join us. Again, here is Derek's contact information if you do have any questions. Derek, I did send this out to a few people, so hopefully they will be contacting you.
Good. Perfect.
So awesome. Well, there's no questions coming through, so I don't think we need to keep anyone on too much longer. So thank you, Derek, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Thanks everyone for attending. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.